I'm Craig Timm, and this is ACAMS Live. Thank you to everyone out there joining us live today, and those who watch later on replay. Feel free to say hi in the comments. Let us know where you're tuning in from. If you've got a question or comment, feel free to put those in there too. We'll try to get to some of those as we go over the course of the discussion. So there's no question that one of the top anti-financial crime challenges over the last year and a half has been the sanctions against Russia and Russia's efforts to evade those sanctions. Since the invasion of Ukraine, the G7 countries have taken what I would say are unprecedented actions to curb Russia's ability to wage war. If you look at the US alone, they've sanctioned over 2,500 Russian-related targets, over 80% of Russia's banking sector by assets. And while that initial focus was on oligarchs and Russian assets abroad, increasingly the focus has turned to battlefield goods. And there's no better person to walk us through the latest on Russian sanction evasion when it comes to battlefield goods than my ACAMS colleague, George Voloshin. So George, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Craig.
So let's just start with some basics. Let's do some level setting so everybody can get on the same page. Can you walk us through the term battlefield goods? So what does it mean in the Russian sanctions context? What are the different categories? What restrictions apply? And maybe some examples of what that might look like.
Sure. So battlefield goods mean what they actually say in the name. So these are the goods that Russia uses on the battlefield in Ukraine. Many of those goods have become known to the West thanks to Ukraine's own efforts to recover them from the battlefield. When a Russian plane, or Russian drone, or Russian tank has been destroyed, they pull out its contents and examine them in detail and to see what kind of components Russia uses to produce its weaponry. And so these goods are crucial to Russia's continuation of the war in Ukraine, its ability to hold these territories under its control. And I think, as you said, there is an increasing focus now on the efforts by the West to curtail Russia's ability to wage war, as opposed to previous attempts, which are still ongoing in parallel, but probably seen as less important now, to punish oligarchs and government officials by freezing their properties. Because, in fact, by doing so, you probably won't dent the Kremlin's ability to wage war, whereas by cracking down on the flow of these goods to Russia, you will certainly weaken Russia's military in a significant fashion. So the battlefield goods, as we know them in sanctions compliance, probably refer best to a list we have from Western Coalition, which we call the Common High Priority Items List, which was released initially in May this year by several jurisdictions. First of all, the EU and UK, and then in July, the US followed as well with its own detailed list of these goods. So Japan also joined the coalition, by the way. So the list initially comprised 38 items divided into 4 tiers. So tiers 1 and 2 are the most sensitive tiers, which actually include things that Russia cannot produce itself in those cases, which it has to import from abroad, or which it produces but in very small quantities. Whereas tiers 3 and 4 are less strategic for the purpose of stopping Russian aggression, but are still important because Russia has not really been able to produce them to a sufficient level. And so in September this year, there was a further addition to the list. So the list is still in 4 tiers, but they have been additions to tier 3, and the total list of goods now comprises 35 items. So tier 3 includes tier 3A and tier 3B. So we have 45 items, which are quite sensitive, of which tiers 1 and 2 are the most sensitive ones. So tier 1 is 4 HS codes and tier 2, 5 HS codes. So HS codes is just a classification of different goods for customs purposes. So HS 6 codes are codes that comprise 6 digits. So 4 in tier 1, 5 in tier 2. And you also have a more granular detail when you break them down into HS 10 codes, to 10-digit codes, which carry even more complexity in terms of how these goods are classified. So that's kind of the general description of what these goods represent.
Great. And I'm just wondering, in terms of examples and can you bring that sort of the categories are great and it's I'm wondering if you could maybe help bring this to life. What does this look like in real life?
Yes, exactly. So I think we have two case studies at hand to demonstrate. So we'll start with tier one, which is really the most important collection of goods that you can see on your screen. So tier one, as I said, 4 HS codes on the left. You have some descriptions further to the right. And you have also a different HS10 codes, which I break down by jurisdiction. So we have a list for the EU and UK, which is the same for both jurisdictions, and also list for the US. So here we have one interesting type of a battlefield good, which is memory devices. And you see on the screen the full HS10 code as defined by UK and EU code nomenclature. And so we're going now to look at one particular example of this type of good moving into Russia in violation of the export controls imposed by the West. So if we can move to the next slide, you can see that there's animation shows you actually the goods moved from China, where they were produced originally. You see the amount that these goods are valid at, as well as their movement initially into France. So the goods were moved into France. They were sitting in a warehouse near Paris. So the important thing to know about these goods is that these goods are China-made, but they are US branded. So they are actually a part of global US manufacturers portfolio of products. And then what happened next is that there was a Turkish company established shortly after the war in Ukraine began in earnest, so almost 2 years ago. And this company actually picked up the goods in the warehouse in France and moved the goods straight into Russia. And there was actually a company in Russia which filed an import declaration in April this year, declaring not only the HS code that you saw in the previous image, but also the contents of this of the import. And so it was actually these memory devices produced in China. What is the problem in terms of compliance obligations of different players involved in this operation? Is that these tier one items are actually very strictly regulated in the US. So first of all, they're all licensable. So I didn't say this before, but all goods in tiers 1 to 4, they are subject to licensing regimes in the US or in the UK and EU, wherever so these restrictions exist. There is an obligation of a license before you can export anything to Russia in particular. And even though the goods were produced not in the US but in China, there is also this important thing to know that there is the so-called foreign direct product rule, so FDP rule, which actually makes it mandatory to obtain a license for these goods, even if they were produced outside of the US, but still are considered to be US-controlled or US origin goods for this purpose. So the Turkish company should have obtained a prior license before exporting the goods to Russia, which it of course didn't. And so, but I think even if it did try to apply for license, it would have seen no willingness from the US side to grant this authorization. And so the goods were imported into Russia without any problem, actually. And you can see in the next image that there is what we call this customs declaration that was filed, which demonstrates to you how this all looks in real life. So you have the date of the transaction, rather of the importation of the memory device in question, April 2023. You have the HS code, which is one of those HS10 codes was shown in the initial image, belonging to tier 1. You have the Russian import company with its address in St. Petersburg. You have the shipper, which is in this case the Turkish intermediary company based in Istanbul, and you have also the location of the product itself from where it was exported. So it was France, country of export, and you have also the place of origin, China. You have also the gross weight, the net weight, and the monetary amounts for this goods. So it was valued at $25,000 for just one memory device. I think we can probably go now into the next example, which is our kind of second case study, which is quite similar in how it presents things, because we're going to take a look at tier 2 of the same common high items priority list. So tier 2, as I said, has 5 HS6 codes. And you can see that here again, I have a breakdown into HS10 codes by jurisdiction. So a list for the EU and UK, the same codes, and a separate list for the US. And so in this category, we have radio navigation receivers, which actually in the US carry two distinct HS10 codes, but they still belong to the same HS6 code and the same tier 1 category. So again, this is very sensitive. They can be used in a variety of applications. So in this case, we're going to take a look at an example where these devices needed for use in aircraft. So next slide, please. Again, something quite similar. We have a map of the world. It will show you how this device was moved from one place to another. So this device actually originates in the US proper. So it is US made, US origin, produced by a well-known American company. So this device initially moved into Turkey, so it was supported by another Turkish intermediary with a quite similar profile, low-profile company, no prior history of transactions, small, but again, probably making good money of these transactions now in the Russian context. And so this company actually imported the goods into Turkey and then shipped them to Russia, again, without any license. Interestingly, the import in Russia is not just a random company. It is a well-known airline. So the company who imported the goods is one of the group of companies that from the airline. The airline is a major one, and it was actually added last year to the U.S. Department of Commerce's denied persons list, which means that this company has actually even no possibility of applying for and obtaining an export license from the U.S. government. So this transaction happened in violation, first of all, of U.S. export control regulations, because there were no license was obtained prior to the transaction. And secondly, even if there had been attempts to do so, they would have been refused because this company is on the DPL list and it cannot even apply for a license now. So we're going to take a look once again at a customs declaration, which is in the next image. We're very similar to the one we saw in the previous example. We have, again, the date. So it is quite a recent transaction. All of that was already restricted by VAN. We have the HS10 code, one of the two that I showed you before in the US. You have the Russian company based in Moscow. You have the Turkish company based in Antalya province, again, a recent creation. And you have also the place of origin, Turkey, so USA, and the country of export, place of export, Turkey. And you have also the weight and the amount. So this good was valued nearly $50,000. So this was, again, as I said, a radio navigational device which is used in civilian aircraft, which this company needed for its own air fleet. So this is how it works in practice. We have lots of examples similar to this one, which we can show people involving intermediaries from not only Turkey, but also other countries in Central Asia, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, etc. And we have similar patterns, similar methods to evade controls, which are repeated across the region, across the world.
Well, that was great, George. Thank you very much. A lot to unpack there, and we're going to start to try to do that now. Thanks to everyone saying hello in the chat. I'm if you see me looking down, I'm watching that coming in. Thanks to Gabby and Guidette. I saw your questions. We'll get to those, so appreciate that. Keep all that coming. It's what makes these live events fun. All right, George, so let's start to unpack some of this right now. I think, one of the things that jumped out is boy, is this complex. And just the scale and sophistication of Russia's ability to evade these sanctions. And you layer that on top of the increasing government focus, the regulatory expectations. This is quite the challenge for those, watching today from financial institutions or exporters, trying to figure out, how do I manage this? So I think let's start with the broad, and then we'll dig into some of the details in terms of, if you're in a financial institution, if you're an exporter here watching today, what do you think are the main takeaways from the cases you just walked through?
Yeah, so I think the main takeaways are as follows. So first of all, you have to acknowledge the fact that these sanctions landscapes have become very complicated, very difficult to unpack, to understand. We've seen a real step change in terms of how difficult these regulations have become since 2022. Although again, Russia is still not as heavily sanctioned as other countries like North Korea or Iran. So there's still place to do business. But again, it's become very dangerous in terms of how efficiently you can comply with different regulations. So I think my first piece of advice would be to everyone is just to reassess your risk appetite. Try and understand where your exposure to Russia is, kind of conduct a enterprise-wide evaluation of your risk exposure by, of course, basing it, first of all, on what we call the Russian nexus. So any Russian indicia will be helpful. If you have Russian customers that do business in Russia, customers with Russian nationals as principals, shareholders, or controllers, customers that may be based in neighboring countries to Russia, that may deal in goods that Russia wants, that may be actually have a history of prior transactions, anything that may indicate there could be exposure. And I think it's very important to understand, first of all, where this exposure is, and then what your risk appetite is. Actually, are you able to take on this extra risk since 2022? Or is it probably not a good idea anymore to try and use old methods in the new situation? So even before going into the risk-based approach, I think is the foundations of any AML, sanctions compliance program, or anything, any risk management program in general, it's important to understand whether, in the first place, you're happy to take the risks that you have not seen previously. And then once this is done, so if you're not happy with the results of this assessment, you can probably try to find a way to maybe de-risk partially or in full by cutting some ties, by maybe withdrawing from certain markets or from certain products entirely. And then what you should do is understand, based on a risk-based approach, where you should allocate your resources. And I'm speaking about everything that you have at your disposal, internal controls, your contractual tools to impose restrictions upon clients, to make them more aware of the risks that you run on your own end, to be tougher with your customers, require more, have more enhanced maybe checks and TM screening checks, etc. So this will all flow down from a risk appetite statement, which you will recreate based on the new reality. And then you will certainly try to reevaluate your risk exposure levels through the risk-based approach. I think that's kind of the foundations of everything, where everything starts.
No, I think that's great advice, because it all does start there. And so, all right, so if I'm out there in the audience, I've established what I'm comfortable with. But, as we've just seen, from your examples, this is pretty sophisticated, and, it's going to be very hard to, completely avoid this type of activity. So you're going to have to be on the lookout, no matter where you set your risk-based approach, for these actors trying to exploit your institution, whether you're a financial institution or an exporter. So, based on some of the things coming out of the government, what do you think are some of the key red flags or risk indicators that sort of after they've set that risk appetite that they need to be monitoring for, to see if sort of unintentionally some of this activity is moving through their institution?
Sure. So we have the benefit of actually having a list of red flags from different regulators already. So there are people in government who took care of this for us. And we have different lists which have common criteria actually on them. So we have a list from the BIS for US exporters and US banks. We have lists from the EU and UK. Also, we have a list issued by the E5. So these are US, UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. So these 5 governments also issued their own list very recently in September. And so we have about 10 primary red flags which we need to look out for. So I think, first of all, it's important to note any players involved in a transaction that were created after February 2022. So companies of recent creation, which may actually be proxies and friend companies or shell companies, whose job is to be intermediaries in a given transaction. As these Turkish companies, by the way, in both examples I previously used were. Then it's important to understand whether the customer that you have in front of you has experience of dealing with these battlefield goods at all. If they have no prior history of transactions in these goods, If they have other business lines which are totally different, it will be a red flag. Why would they suddenly start trading these goods overnight? Then, of course, if these customers even have some experience, it will be important to understand if they have any spikes in volumes that they commission from different governments, different countries, why these spikes happen, what they are due to. Is it because they're growing the business very substantially, or is it because they're re-exporting from their traditional markets into Russia in violation of sanctions? Then, of course, any customer who's evasive, like they're not going to disclose to you who they work with, their banks, their shippers, their third parties, their agents in different places, this is all an indication of potential evasion. Also, if they commission small volumes from different similar companies, different manufacturers, and they pay for these supplies from a foreign bank account, this may indicate an attempt to consolidate small packages, small volumes of similar goods into bigger shipment, and then all of that goes potentially to Russia. Also, if they try to replace the real end users with some type of intermediaries like freight forwarding companies, etc., and in general, if they don't want to provide any commitments, or they're trying to kind of lie to you straight in your face about the end use of the goods. So something that doesn't look realistic or doesn't look plausible should be a cause for concern. And of course, if they overpay for the goods as well above market rates, this is also an indication of potential evasion.
So that's great stuff to look out for, and so I imagine this is sort of great. You're actually walking us through a sort of real live risk assessment right now. You started with that in one. You've walked us through some of the risks that we need to be on the lookout for, how they're going to attempt to misuse your institution, whether you're selling these goods or whether you're a financial institution. So now let's turn to controls. I imagine there's a number of things that institutions should be thinking about doing to stop that, from CDD to screening to transaction monitoring to client agreements. There's probably a whole bunch of things. What advice would you give to the audience in terms of controls they can put in place to try to mitigate the risk that you've highlighted?
Yes, absolutely. So I think all controls should be seen holistically. So all controls should play their role in the prevention of evasion by Russia. So first of all, have robust governance. Maybe you should revert to governance framework, because the risk is higher. You should maybe have a special channel reporting internally to your board, to senior management. You must probably have more specialized personnel working on these trade deals, which involve a lot of technical detail. Maybe you should have more robust protocols regarding reporting, escalation of alerts, etc. So governance is really key. Overhaul your policies, reassess them. Do they actually meet the requirement, which is current in terms of complying with sanctions against Russia? Then, of course, all of that follows from this is important too. KYC, CDD, anything that touches Russia today will be high risk. So you should have means and resources to be able to vet your customers and suppliers, applying higher criteria, higher standards of verification to their business transactions. TM also sanction screening as well, and enhanced at all times. So you should be able to reparameter your software, your managed screening tools, to be able to catch those potential transactions involving battlefield goods by HS code, by description, in different languages if necessary. So again, as I said, if you don't have that in place, probably your risk appetite is off. You should probably reassess again this very basic thing. Then, of course, contractual defenses, sanctions clauses, self-attestations. By the way, I have model from the E5 on battlefield goods, which is attached to the red flags samples. So you should have all of that. Staff training is very important. Train your staff, train your personnel, frontline compliance staff as well. These red flags are the basis, the starting point, but also kind of real-life transactions should be used to train your staff on real-life examples. And then, of course, customer outreach. Frontline staff should be prepared to challenge customers on anything that doesn't seem right. So be prepared to challenge the narratives, because they may be lying to you.
Yeah, so that's great. I want to turn now, we've got just a couple minutes left. I want to turn now to a couple of questions from our audience today. And the first is, I'm going to sort of combine two from Gabby and Guidette that both relate to reporting. So, despite all of your best efforts to, prevent this activity from, your institution from being involved in this activity. You haven't done it, but you've got controls that have identified it. I think, so we have a general question on, can you talk a little bit about reporting? And then we have a more specific question around, Part 746, Supplement 4, and reporting to OFAC. I don't know if you know those details, but I think before we start with anything, I'd say this stuff is very complex. And so I think making sure that you are very engaged with your legal department, whether it's internal lawyers, whether it's external lawyers, and getting guidance on this. I know in the US, for example, an OFAC violation is strict liability. So you can be punished even if you didn't intend to do it. So it's very important. I'm going to turn the question to George and allow him to sort of share what he can share. But this stuff is so complex that you really need to be working with your lawyers anytime an issue around this comes up to make sure you understand exactly what you can and can't do in the specific circumstances. But George, I'm wondering if you can tell us just a little bit give us some guidance around reporting in maybe a minute or two.
Yeah, so first of all, reporting if you have a potential suspected breach. This is self-disclosure. You have very specific guidelines from the US government. We're talking about the US. So it's very kind of well set in stone what you should do in this case, self-report as early as possible and cooperate. Another question is potentially of more value because very often you see some signs of evasion, some potential red flags, but not sure of your own assessment. So in this case, you should file SARs of STRs in your jurisdiction. And actually, in a very kind of helpful way, we have some extra guidance from regulators. And we also have, for example, from FinCEN in the US, we have special tags now in STR templates which you can fill with Russia-related content. So this is maybe about oligarchs, maybe about trade evasion, luxury goods. You have for each of these restrictions, you have a special tag. So when we report this, the report actually will explain the narrative as usual, but it will probably go to the top of the pile and be seen as a priority by regulators and then maybe investigate in detail. So I think reporting doesn't require anything different from what you are used to doing. So same STRs, same SARs, but be specific about sanctions concerns, put them up front, make sure that it's understood from the beginning that this is about trade evasion or sanctions breaches that you're suspecting, and you're flagging this to your governments. And so when you do this, you will also be able to kind of, in your own kind of archive, you will be collecting more intelligence, more data. And then maybe at some point, either we'll be able to connect the dots or the government will go back to you and say, okay, we need to look in something more specifically because we have a story emerging from different SARs filed by different institutions, different banks, for example, across the country. So this can be a really productive exchange. Later.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight, I know from the US perspective, and I imagine elsewhere, if they've given you one of those codes to use, they really do use it. It means a lot to FinCEN. The other thing for those watching in the US, I would really consider when you identify some of this activity, think about using 314B. Think about engaging the counterparties if you can. We've heard from FinCEN that that's been, they think, a little bit underutilized here. And some of the most valuable information they've gotten has come as a result of information sharing amongst institutions. So definitely think about that too. Well, unfortunately, I think we could spend all day here with you, George, but we don't have time. We're almost at the bottom of the hour. So George, I want to thank you so much for being here. The good news is while George and I can't, virtually spend all day with you, we've got a lot more information on all of this. So led by, our ACAMS colleague, Justine Walker, George, Sam Cousins, we've developed a whole array of materials for you to learn more about this. So from our monthly updates to masterclasses and webinars to a planning assumptions paper that came out earlier this year, to a forthcoming sanctions evasion toolkit that George has been working on that'll be coming in the next couple of weeks. You can check out all of those on the sanctions space section of our ACAMS website. We'll go ahead and put a link in the comments. We've got hours and hours, and probably days, frankly, of materials for you to get as educated as you want to be on the subject. So thank you very much, George. Again, thank you to everyone being here today. Really appreciate the engagement in the comments. If we haven't gotten all the questions, we'll try to get to them in the comments. And look forward to seeing you all on the next edition of ACAMS Live.